Earlier this year, China crossed a major milestone when BYD, an electric car company based in its Shaanxi province, surpassed Tesla in total sales. What's more, most experts believe the country is only at the beginning of its EV dominance. In a recent Washington Post article titled How China Pulled Ahead to Become the World Leader in Electric Vehicles, journalist Christian Shepard explained how the country's centralized, top-down government prioritized every level of the supply chain, from the building materials to the manufacturing to the charging stations. In a recent interview, we discussed what decisions the country made over a decade ago to incentivize EV production, to the point where it can sell cars at nearly half the price of its non-Chinese competitors. We also explored what the US would have to do if it wants to catch up. Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Long Story, the show that features the best long-form journalism on the web. If you want to listen to an audio version of this show, subscribe to The Long Story wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, let's jump into the interview. Hey Christian, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
So we're here to talk about this great piece of long-form reporting that you did on why Chinese automakers are pulling so far ahead of the rest of the world, including the U.S. And I guess to start talking about this, we kind of have to dial back like 10 years ago, because China made a series of kind of policy decisions that they wanted to ramp up EV production. Like, how did the government begin prioritizing EVs 10 years ago?
Yeah, it has been a long time coming. Originally, China first became interested in EVs even before the policy push 10 years ago, with some officials who came back from stints in Europe and saw the beginnings of an EV industry there and decided that this was an area that China could potentially pull ahead in. And the reason they were so interested in EVs was that the traditional automakers in China had always really struggled to compete in internal combustion engine technology. They had, been trying for many years, often through joint venture partnerships with international automakers to catch up with the likes of, General Motors, Mercedes, everyone that was operating in China, but they still found that their ability to make gas powered cars wasn't really matching up, certainly not on a global level. And so this shift across to battery powered cars looked to China like a potential opening for it to find an area where its automakers could pull ahead, and that's exactly what they did. So in 2015, they released a plan called Made in China 2025, where they identified a bunch of different areas which were going to be a top priority for the government. And one of those were electric vehicles.
And yeah, you write in your piece that like prior to this, when wealthy Chinese citizens would buy cars, it was usually foreign made cars just because they were such better quality than the internal combustion engine cars of that were built in China.
Exactly. You didn't want to be seen dead in a Chinese made car if you were a middle class, well off Chinese person. You wanted an Audi, you wanted a Cadillac, right? I mean, even in the lower levels, right, people were much more likely to drive a Volkswagen than they were to drive a Chinese brand.
And how much of this decision was also had to do with their quest for like energy independence? Like China has long time made an investment in solar energy, wind industry, energy, and stuff like that. Obviously, electric cars running on electricity, they're less reliant on foreign oil. Do you think that was part of it as well?
It's always been a part of it. And yes, it's true that China does not have its own significant gas deposits, oil deposits. It has always been a mixture of factors, but the primary one really for China is this industrial competitiveness. China views its ability to own the technologies of the future as being critical to its ability to rise as an economic and geopolitical power.
So, what did they do specifically to kind of galvanize and push this technology forward?
Well, it started out with a lot of trials in various parts of the country, and they kind of went out to different local governments, different automakers, and said, okay, this is a priority now. you see if you can support the industry and make it work. And so this led to a lot of subsidies. It led to tax breaks. It led to purchasing programs where the local automaker would try and create its own EV model, and then it'd be bought to become the local taxi fleet. And so what you started to see was this competition taking place within China, where all these local governments and their local automakers were trying to become the leader in electric vehicles. And of course, that created a lot of waste. There was a lot of people just gaming the system to try and claim the subsidies, but not really innovating. But it also created this hyper competitive environment where eventually they were able to create some of the real champions that we see today, companies like BYD, that are outselling Tesla.
And basically, what happened is it wasn't just EV companies; it was like every part of the supply chain, right?
Yeah. So the way that the local government system worked was that you would have your automaker, and the automaker would say, look, in order for me to be competitive in EVs, I'm going to need a battery maker. I'm going to need people who are creating whatever it might be, right? Every single part of the supply chain. And so the government would go about trying to attract those companies, or even potentially set them up within the locality so that they would have this what's called vertical integration. And that would allow the companies, when they're making their cars, not to have to source from elsewhere. Everything would all be in one place. And then the added benefit of that later, when the industry became more mature, was that if you needed to tweak something, if you needed to upgrade something, you could just go down the road to the nearby supplier and say, look, you need to change this. And they could do it within matters of days, weeks.
And but flash forward 10 years, and now there's been developed, like you write about these industrial zones. What are these industrial zones?
Yeah, so they're kind of where a lot of these ecosystems ended up. And most of them are built around one or two really big EV makers. So the one that I visited is in a place called Jinhua, which is in the east of China in Zhejiang province. And there they actually started very, very early. They were one of these first trial zones. And for a long time, they kind of struggled, but now they have this one automaker called Leap, and that has enabled them to have a kind of champion that they have built the whole supply chain around. And when I'm talking about the whole supply chain, I really mean everything. You have apartments there, you have parks dedicated to automotive culture. There's kind of this idea that you can have everything you need in a very small geographic radius. And then that'll allow the company to be extremely competitive. They're also sourcing the top talent from Chinese universities, people who have PhDs in engineering. Um, so it's just being able to bring everything together in one place has proved to be a winning formula for some of these automakers.
So the way I understand it is like there are entire cities in China that are dedicated to different parts of the supply chain. Is this what this is? It's like it's just a series of cities that are just like it's a you would if you were walking through it, it just looked like a city, but it's actually like almost a wholly centered around like this one industry.
Yeah, you do have sort of areas of cities normally rather than the whole city that will be just fully dedicated. So the place that I went to was called the New Energy Vehicle Town, right? That's the name of it. There's big signage everywhere. And every company in there does something that enables the manufacturing of new energy vehicles. And it's a top priority for the town. So not only have they, provided subsidies, they have now provided direct investment. And this is the same across China, for a lot of major cities, is they have these government guided funds that are meant to take a stake in up and coming companies in emerging industries, with the hope that that will get them through the difficult period of being essentially a startup for many of these companies. But it then means that the government is deeply invested when they do start to succeed. So it has a stake in more ways than one.
Is the analogy like 1960s Detroit, or is that a bad analogy?
I think there are parts of it that are similar. And certainly when you talk to people in China, they will mention that, one of the things Detroit did so well at that time period was to have everything all in one place, which made it so much more competitive. Um, but I think there's also a very uniquely Chinese approach to this, which is quite heavily directed by the state at various times. The companies, they do consider themselves innovative private companies, but they are still very dependent on these ecosystems and the state support in order to succeed.
And you mentioned BYD. That's considered, I think it's considered the most successful electric car company in the world. It famously surpassed Tesla in sales, I think, in 2024. Why is it so successful?
So BYD is one of the ones that got in very early and realized that they needed to make vertical integration kind of key. So they actually started as a battery maker, and then they were able to shift into EVs later on. For a long time, BYD was growing very well, doing lots of good things, but struggling to turn it into anything close to a business model. And this was this problem with China's policy for ages. They just weren't selling enough cars. EVs were sort of dependent on state handouts. Um, and what's happened in the last few years is that because the market has grown to a scale where people are buying, EVs instead of very high-end gas-powered cars, that enabled BYD to build um, to ramp up its production. And it now, is not just selling huge numbers within China, but globally. And it's also shifted from doing just low-end cars to things that compete with the likes of Tesla. Um, but really, I think the thing that worked for BYD is it managed to tap into these local ecosystems. It had very strong backing in its locality, and then it also set up factories elsewhere in the country, which were able to kind of spread its bets. So if there was one area that wasn't doing particularly well, it would have factories elsewhere. And so it's a bit of being one of the early movers, but it's also this ability to have both the battery technology, to have the entire supply chain under their own control.
But would you say like just price is probably one of the biggest advantage that it has over all its competitors, or at least its Western competitors?
Yes. And within China, within the Chinese EV ecosystem, price has really been the key thing. Um, yes, they are very innovative companies. Yes, they do create, pretty good cars, but they do it at a cost that is just far, far below anything you would hope to find in Europe or the US. And BYD was really the leader there. That's part of why they were so keen on bringing everything in-house because it enabled them to find areas where they could cut costs and didn't have to rely on their suppliers.
What's the EV charger situation in China? Because China, in terms of like geography, it's very large, like the U.S. Lots of rural area. How effective have they been about building out that kind of infrastructure?
Yeah, pretty effective. Because China is uh, a sort of top-down economy where these directives that come from the government matter a lot. They're very, very good at big infrastructure build out. And so that has meant that things like charging are uh, also considered a priority by local governments and something that they can relatively easily achieve. So they can say, we have grown the number of charging spots by X number in the last 2 years. So it started mostly in the cities, and still EV ownership is far, far higher in major cities. But there is now a push, as there has been for the last 3 or 4 years, to introduce charging stations into the countryside. So it's getting to the stage now where you could quite happily drive anywhere down sort of the eastern coastline of China, and you'll be able to find a charger, no matter where you are.
So let's talk about the U.S. now. Would it be accurate to say that you can't buy any of these cars in the U.S. currently?
Just about none, yes. So the mixture of extremely high tariffs as well as the concerns over the potential for the smart connected cars, which almost all of Chinese EVs are, to be used to have potential security concerns. that means that in general, there's just no way Chinese cars can be sold in the US right now.
Yeah, so there's 100% tariffs, and then because of because of the connectivity, there's a specific ban on any kind of like basically smart car or anything like that. Is that correct?
Exactly right. And the funny thing about that, I didn't include this in the piece, is that China really started that because China realized when Teslas were selling very well that these cars had cameras, they were, connected to the cloud. Um, China started banning Teslas from certain military and state-owned compounds. And so that was really the beginning of this series of concerns that then the US looked at and said, actually, okay, we kind of realized we could have a similar problem if Chinese EVs are being sold here. Um, so now China is, very angry with the United States for putting in place this ban, but really it's something that they had already been doing.
Yeah, so like the argument is that if it has a camera on it, that it could be recording at all times and basically sending kind of spatial maps constantly back to China. It's also why the U.S. has banned a lot of drone companies from China, is because there's that same paranoia that while the camera on the drone is recording for whoever owns it, it might also be recording aerial shots from for China as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right.
So, what's the situation in the U.S. in terms of like supply chain and like or so I think part of the reason that you kind of pinpoint in your piece of why China has been so successful is there was this top down push. Obviously, they have like a more autocratic government that's more unified and can push policies more straightforward. Would you say like the policy in the U.S. is just much more fragmented, and that's partially why we've fallen behind?
Yeah, so one thing that I heard a lot, and I report on EVs, but also on other areas of clean technology, is that China's state support mattered a lot, but also its consistency was crucial. So when you come to the United States, there have been pushes to make headway in EVs, batteries, solar, all of these things, but it doesn't have the same consistency because in a democratic system, different governments have different approaches. And in particularly in the US, there's more of a stop-start, and so that makes it very difficult for companies that might want to, go long on the potential for a new emerging technology like EVs to do so. And you saw this again and again in China, where there was a company that looked promising from a technology standpoint, but just did not have the ability to make money because there wasn't a market, right? People weren't buying EVs at scale at that time, and the government would step in. Um, they would step in to save the company, and that you just can't see happening in the US, or certainly it'd be a lot harder. I should note that I'm not someone who reports in the US, has spent that much time there, but that's my understanding. It would be very, very hard for that kind of intervention to take place in the same way that it does fairly regularly in China.
And as you talked about before, it's not just China funded these EV companies, it was every part of the supply chain. What is that like in the US? Like, are we able to control every part of the supply chain, or are even US car makers of EV, are they having to rely on China for their supply chain?
Yes, so that's another big piece of this. China has had a setup where they're very focused on the idea that we have everything and it's all very integrated. Not just China as a country, but each individual city within China wants that to happen. I mean, the US industry, and again, not an expert, but my understanding is that for the last few decades, it's been more of an attempt to focus in on a very particular thing. So you find your niche, you're very good at one thing, but then you rely on suppliers elsewhere in the country or elsewhere in the world for all the bits and pieces you need to bring together the final product. And that has often meant relying on China. China, factory of the world, making a lot of the basic pieces that would go into these Cadillacs that would then be sold in the US. But it's now got to the stage where not only do they make all the basic bits, but they also make every single bit of the supply chain. And that enables them to innovate on a process level. So they can say, okay, we want a slightly different screen for this thing, this car. And that's something that you just don't have in the US. If a US automaker wanted to go to all their suppliers and say, I would like to change X, Y, Z, they're probably going to multiple different countries, or certainly a far, long way away, right? And I think that is just, it's something that almost happened by accident because China had to start at the bottom of the value chain and work its way up. But now it's a real strength for their automotive industry.
So BYD doesn't sell in the U.S. Where is it selling outside of China? Where are a lot of its sales coming from?
I mean, basically everywhere else. Originally they started to focus on the European market because in Europe there was a lot more support from in terms of subsidies. But now because tariffs have been introduced in the EU as well, they're focusing a lot more on the global south, as they call it. So the developing world, they're looking at factories in Mexico. They've got a lot of production in Southeast Asia. They also have, so many exports these days that they have brought their own ships to cargo ships in order to transport cars. So they are really, all in on the idea of going global. They just know that they can't go to the US in the near future.
Yeah, I think you said that you say in your piece that Europe has like 35% tariffs on it, and but even with that level of tariffs, they're still price competitive to a certain extent.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So, people look at the kind of ability for Chinese cars to remain price competitive. And the amazing thing is that China's companies like BYD, they will sell the exact same car. They will sell, you know, uh, an Atto 3, for example, at a certain price point within China, and they'll sell it for almost double that uh, in Europe. And so when you're looking at that markup, taking 35% off that, it's not a huge deal. It's not ideal for the company. They would like to be making a lot more money, but they're still going to make more money in Europe than they would in China.
And in fact, European car companies are actually collaborating with some of these Chinese EV makers. How are they collaborating?
Yeah, this is one of the fascinating things that's happened fairly recently and was part of the reason I wanted to write this piece. Because while the US is trying to make its own auto industry compete with China by keeping out Chinese cars, the European approach has been very different. And this is mostly led by the companies rather than the European governments. But the push has been to try and find Chinese partners who are um, very strong in EVs and to go into joint ventures with them, partnerships where they will often be jointly developing new models. Perhaps the biggest example of this is Volkswagen, which for a long time has had a third of its sales in China, has now started to really struggle, and so they partnered up with a company called Xpeng, which is one of China's leading EV makers. And they are now developing new models together. They have gone all in on production in the city of Hefei, which is one of the places to first use this model of getting all the suppliers in the same place, taking stakes in automakers. So what you're seeing there is really a reversal of the dynamic from a few decades ago. A few decades ago, it was the Chinese automakers who really wanted to have JVs with international automakers so they could learn about how to make internal combustion engines. Now it's kind of flipped.
Well, what's in it for the Chinese companies? Why even work with Volkswagen in the first place?
They
Is
want
this for car? Is this for cars they're going to sell in China or sell cars they're going to sell in Germany? Where are these cars being produced and where are they being sold?
So they're produced almost always in China, but the idea is that they will be sold globally. And so that's what you get from your international partner. If you're a Chinese EV maker, you get the potential to tap into their sales network, potentially to use their brand um, in their home markets, which otherwise would have been extremely difficult for you to access. And there is the potential that they will start to manufacture some cars overseas. So in the case of Leap Motor, the company that I sort of profiled more for this piece, they have begun to manufacture some of their cars in Poland. Though mostly this is kind of using kits, right? So they send an almost finished vehicle that just kind of gets put together. But in the long run, there are more Chinese companies looking at investing in manufacturing overseas, and if they can do that with an international partner, that would make it a lot easier for them.
Does that allow, or does that help them bypass the tariffs at all?
Potentially, it's still a lot of that will depend on the specifics of how much they produce locally. But I think that's what they're hoping.
Okay, Christian, those are all the questions I have for you. Where can people find you online?
Um, Read the post, subscribe and read the post. I am on Twitter, but I don't really use it very much, or X, I should say.
Awesome. Well, thanks. This was a lot of fun.
Great. All right, it's great to chat with you.